There was a plantation in the deep South where no slave ever dared to run, where the fences weren't enough to keep them in, and the overseers weren't enough to scare them. But decades later, the truth emerged, hidden in dusty ledgers, letters, and confessions that historians could barely believe. It was a place shrouded in mystery, a plantation unlike any other. The stories of fear, submission, and survival that we've all heard about in history seemed absent here. Unlike other plantations, where desperate attempts to escape were common, and the crack of the overseer's whip echoed across the fields, this particular plantation remained eerily quiet. Slaves stayed. They toiled. They suffered, yes, but they did not flee. Historians spent years trying to understand why. Was it the cruelty? No. Was it the generosity of the plantation owners? Hardly. The answer was far more disturbing, far more complex. The documents they discovered painted a picture of a place designed to control every aspect of a person's life, not through violence alone, but through fear, manipulation, and a methodical system that left the enslaved with almost no hope, no way to resist. To understand this plantation, we must first step back into the early 1800s, when slavery was at its peak in the American South. Plantations were not just farms. They were small, self-contained worlds, and those who ran them had perfected ways to maintain power. Yet, what makes this plantation stand out is not what it did differently in its work. It's what it did differently in its control. The land itself seemed to work against escape. Rivers with hidden undertows, dense forests that twisted like a maze, and patrolled paths that made even the slightest movement risky. But geography alone did not account for the absence of runaways. Letters from nearby plantations described similar terrain, similar risks, yet escapes happened constantly elsewhere. Something else was at play here, something hidden within the walls, the fields, and the very daily life of those enslaved. And as the historians dug deeper, they found chilling evidence of a system that was almost psychological in its precision. Rewards for loyalty, punishments designed to isolate and terrify, surveillance that went beyond eyes and ears, reaching into the hearts and minds of those who lived there. This plantation wasn't just a farm. It was a machine for breaking the human spirit. By the time we reach the next section, you will understand the full methods this plantation used to ensure that not a single person ever attempted to flee, and the shocking revelations that came from personal diaries, court documents, and letters that no one had read for more than a century. Every day on the plantation began before sunrise. The slaves rose not to the sound of birds or nature, but to the harsh clanging of a bell that marked not just the start of labor, but the start of a system meticulously designed to consume their lives. Fields stretched endlessly, lined with crops that seemed to grow taller than the humans working them, and overseers moved among the rows with an ever-watchful gaze. Yet, the most extraordinary thing wasn't the work itself. It was the invisible system of control. The owners, known to outsiders as unusually strict, weren't known for excessive physical violence. Instead, they had perfected psychological methods that made rebellion almost unimaginable. One document, a ledger found tucked behind the master's desk, described a loyalty system that assigned certain privileges to those who obeyed without question. Extra rations, lighter tasks, even the ability to sleep in slightly better quarters. But these rewards were a trap. They created tension between families, friends, and neighbors. Those who tried to speak out or step away from the assigned routines found themselves isolated. Their privileges were revoked, rumors spread, and slowly, over weeks and months, fear seeped into the very marrow of their existence. What escaped notice at first glance was that this fear didn't need chains or whips to take hold. It grew quietly, insidiously, like a shadow in the sun. The plantation also had a system of constant surveillance. Not just overseers on horseback, but a network of informants, slaves themselves who were coerced into reporting small infractions. Even whispers were punished. Personal letters between family members were read and censored. Escape routes were known in advance because the owners had mapped the surrounding forest, the rivers, and the neighboring plantations with near military precision. And yet, there was something even darker, the knowledge of what awaited a failed escapee. Word of failed attempts spread quickly, exaggerated deliberately. Some were punished in public, but others simply disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to them. The uncertainty itself became a weapon, a psychological barrier far stronger than chains or fences. It wasn't just fear of punishment that kept the enslaved in place. It was the understanding that running could cost everything: family, safety, even life. Letters from neighboring plantations revealed stories of escapes gone wrong, of hunters tracking people through forests for miles. But on this plantation, the owner's planning had already made that risk clear. There was no hiding, no safety beyond the boundaries, and no mercy waiting outside the gates. Even religion was used as a tool of control. The plantation provided ministers who preached obedience and patience, describing the suffering of slavery as a divine test. Some slaves later wrote that the sermons made them question their own thoughts of escape, framing resistance as not just dangerous, but morally wrong. And yet, despite all this, the human spirit flickered quietly in secret. Some would whisper stories of the outside world. Some would carve symbols into trees. Others kept hidden letters and small mementos of life before, or imagined life beyond, the plantation gates. But these small acts of defiance were carefully managed, rarely noticed, and never enough to inspire mass escape. By the end of this section, you begin to understand. The lack of escape was not because the slaves were less brave, or less desperate, or less human. It was because the plantation had become a machine for breaking the will, without leaving obvious scars, and its methods were so effective, so meticulously recorded, that even generations later, historians are still uncovering the chilling truths about the lives lived and trapped here. Historians were stunned when they finally gained access to the plantation's private archives. Hidden behind locked doors and forgotten drawers were journals, letters, and ledgers that no outsider had seen for more than a century. What they revealed was a system far more terrifying than any physical punishment could achieve, a system designed to break the human while maintaining the illusion of normality. One of the first documents discovered was a journal kept by the plantation manager. It detailed daily routines in almost obsessive detail: who woke up when, who worked where, who received special privileges, and most disturbingly, who had shown even the slightest hint of disobedience. Each entry read like a map of human behavior, tracking not just actions but thoughts. The manager recorded suspicions, conversations, and even dreams shared by slaves in private moments. Every detail was cataloged, analyzed, and used to tighten control. Then there were the letters between the plantation owner and nearby peers. In them, the owner boasted not of wealth or productivity, but of perfect compliance among the enslaved. He described techniques of fear and persuasion, subtle reward to encourage obedience, strategic punishments that instilled terror, and most chillingly, the careful cultivation of despair. One letter explicitly stated, "They will not flee, for they know the world outside is far crueler than the walls they inhabit." The documents also revealed a cruel method of psychological manipulation. Families were kept in close quarters, but trust was systematically broken. Informers, slaves coerced into reporting small infractions, ensured that no one felt safe confiding in another. Even friendships were monitored, subtly punished if deemed too close. Historians describe this as a form of invisible chains, ones that could not be cut, only endured. Perhaps the most chilling discovery came from a series of letters describing the consequences of failed escapes. The letters were vague, referencing removal or re-education, but local court records and burial logs suggested that those who attempted to flee were never heard from again. The owner used ambiguity deliberately, ensuring that fear of the unknown became a stronger deterrent than any whip could be. The plantation's layout itself was also documented in these records with meticulous care. Escape routes were mapped and controlled, rivers crossed with hidden patrols, forests watched through hidden paths. Even seemingly random elements, the placement of crops, the alignment of paths, were designed to confuse anyone trying to navigate the terrain. Slaves learned over time that attempting escape was almost certainly a death sentence, or worse, permanent disappearance. Yet even with all this, the documents occasionally revealed small acts of resistance. A note tucked in a ledger mentioned a hidden pocket of flour left for a family, a carved symbol on a tree, or a whispered story of freedom. These small, almost invisible acts reminded historians that despite the overwhelming control, the human spirit never fully surrendered. It simply learned to survive within the cage that had been constructed so carefully. By the end of this section, the truth becomes undeniable. This plantation achieved what no other did. It prevented escape not by sheer violence alone, but by an intricate system of psychological domination, environmental control, and social manipulation. And as we move into the next section, we will explore the lives of the enslaved in more personal detail, their fears, their hopes, and the small, defiant sparks of resistance that existed even under this perfect oppression. The most haunting discoveries came not from ledgers or maps, but from the personal writings of the enslaved themselves. Hidden diaries, scraps of paper, and coded messages revealed a world of fear and subtle rebellion. Lives constrained by invisible chains, yet still clinging to hope. One diary belonged to a young woman named Eliza. Her words were simple, almost childlike, but carried a depth of fear and intelligence that shocked historians. She described waking before dawn, the chill of the fields, the sound of the overseer's boots on the hard earth, and the quiet whispers of others who feared speaking too loudly. Yet she also wrote about small acts of defiance, hiding a stolen piece of bread, teaching a younger child to read in secret, or whispering stories of distant relatives who had once lived free. Another testimony came from a man named Samuel, whose account had been preserved in a series of letters sent secretly to a distant relative. He wrote of the fear that never sleeps, a constant anxiety that followed every action. Samuel described how some slaves pretended to obey while planning subtle sabotage, overturning tools, misplacing crops, or secretly warning each other of overseers' movements. These acts were small, almost invisible, yet they were the lifelines that kept their spirits alive. Families on the plantation faced the cruelest challenges. The system of rewards and punishments often forced children to witness the suffering of their parents or even betray their siblings for small privileges. Historians noted letters where parents described hiding their tears, fearing that even the slightest display of grief might be used against them. Yet in private moments, they whispered songs and stories of freedom, nurturing hope in the next generation. One of the most chilling accounts described the absence of hope beyond the plantation. Slaves were aware that the world outside was not a sanctuary. Word of runaway slaves captured and punished elsewhere spread quickly. Letters written in code hinted that attempts to flee often ended in death, mutilation, or permanent disappearance. This knowledge created a psychological cage, where even thought of escape became a risk too great to imagine. Despite the oppression, there were moments of light. Hidden symbols carved into trees marked secret meeting places. Stories were told under the cover of night, passing knowledge, survival tactics, and dreams of freedom. Some slaves learned the patterns of the overseers, predicting when and where they would be, using subtle tricks to steal moments of respite. Each small act was a rebellion, quiet but significant, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Historians emphasize that understanding these lives requires more than just looking at records. It demands empathy and imagination, stepping into the shoes of people forced to survive in a place where hope itself was a weapon against them. And yet, even under perfect control, they found ways to assert their humanity, to whisper stories of courage, and leave traces of their existence that would be discovered a century later. By the end of this section, viewers begin to feel the human weight of the story. Not just the fear, but the courage, the cleverness, and the quiet defiance that made the enslaved people more than just victims. They were survivors. And as we move into the final section, we uncover the ultimate revelations. Why this plantation remained unchallenged, and how the world eventually learned the full, shocking truth about its methods. Historians finally pieced together the full picture, and the truth was as chilling as it was meticulous. This plantation had created an environment where escape was not only physically dangerous, it was psychologically impossible. The combination of fear, manipulation, isolation, and surveillance had turned enslaved into people who believed that leaving was more terrifying than staying. One key revelation was the calculated use of uncertainty. The owners understood that not all punishments needed to be public. Some who attempted to flee simply vanished, and the mystery of their fate spread fear faster than any whip or chain could. The uncertainty itself became a weapon, a tool that ensured compliance without excessive violence. Every whispered warning, every rumor, every story of disappearance reinforced the invisible boundaries of control. Historians also discovered that the plantation was essentially a self-contained society designed to maintain absolute obedience. Every aspect of life, from work schedules to meals, from religious instruction to family interactions, was meticulously structured. The enslaved were monitored constantly, not just by overseers, but by other slaves forced to act as informants. Friendships, romantic relationships, and family ties were manipulated to create mistrust, ensuring no collective rebellion could form. And yet, there was more to the story than fear. The psychological control worked because the enslaved had no realistic path to freedom. Outside the plantation, the world was full of dangers. Other plantations, slave hunters, harsh terrain, and towns where they could be easily captured. Every escape attempt, or even the thought of it, carried near certain consequences. The plantation owners had studied the surrounding geography, neighboring properties, and even laws, creating an environment where running away was not just discouraged. It was suicide. The personal accounts we uncovered show that this control was absolute, yet fragile. In secret, the enslaved found ways to resist, to leave traces of their lives, and to maintain hope in the smallest ways. Songs, symbols, whispers, and hidden acts of kindness allowed them to survive psychologically, even when physical freedom was impossible. These acts remind us that even under the most oppressive conditions, human resilience cannot be completely erased. In the end, the plantation's legacy is both horrifying and fascinating. It challenges everything we think we know about slavery. The lack of escape was not a result of obedience or submission. It was a deliberate, highly effective system of domination designed to make fear, uncertainty, and psychological control more powerful than chains. The documents, diaries, and letters confirm that this was not an accident. It was a calculated strategy, executed with chilling precision. As we close this story, the lessons are stark. History is filled with acts of resistance, courage, and survival. Yet some systems are so meticulously designed that survival becomes a quiet act of defiance. This plantation was one such place, a place where the enslaved survived in spirit, even when their bodies were trapped. And as historians continue to uncover these hidden truths, we are reminded of both the depths of human cruelty and the enduring strength of the human soul.